Good evening, Valeriy Viktorovich.
Good evening.
Good evening, dear viewers, listeners and guests in the studio. Today is April the 12th, 2021, Cosmonautics Day. Today we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the first human spaceflight. The question relates to this event. On April the 12th, 1961, what country launched a spacecraft piloted by Gagarin? The fact is that now on federal TV channels and even on the website of State Space Corporation, Roscosmos, a photograph of Yuri Gagarin circulates on which his helmet has no the USSR inscription. Is it an accident or are there purposeful conspiracy?
The issue of celebrating such a significant date as the 60th anniversary of the launch of the first man into space raises many questions. What country did it? Why did all Russian federal channels deliberately remove any mention of the USSR? Some channels went even further. They erased the inscription of the USSR from the famous documentary shots where Gagarin's helmet bears the name of the country. What is going on? How could we arrive at that point at all? On the other hand, let us have a look at the celebration of this anniversary. If it is proportional to the role in the history of the entire humankind. Bizarrely, Russian TV channels didn't carry out any PR campaign on this event. There were no public events as well. One could see purely ritual events in general, which, however, were presented in a way to reduce the very significance of the first human journey into outer space. It is not by accident. The flag mounted on the Kremlin determines what happens in the country. The truth is that under the present flag, those people who don't want Russia to exist in any form have always fought. They fought to destroy Russia. There is an expression, the grimy cannot do anything, from the film An Unfinished Piece for Mechanical Piano. The Russian aristocracy has always lived according to that principle. Grimy the cattle cannot do it. If it is a German peasant, it is one thing. However, a Russian peasant is nothing. English peasants are good, but not Russian ones. Russian aristocrats didn't value their peasants at all. How on earth can they compete with brainy foreigners? Our elite has always been West-oriented. It has never been pro-Russian and always betrayed us. However, a revolution took place which opened possibilities to learn for everyone, so that any person who had certain talents could succeed and reveal his genetic potential to the fullest. Whether one was born a peasant or a worker, if he had an inclination for some scientific activity, he for sure would become a great scientist. Under the Red Russian banner, Russia became the superpower #1. Contrary to those who ran to Hitler, who joined interventionists during the Civil War, believed that Russia will never become great and that it needs badly to invite Hitler the Great Effendi for him to put things right in the country. That is why all sorts of the Krasnovites and the likes fled and started to fight under the tricolor. Unexpectedly for them, it turned out that only 12 years after the most destructive war, the country that lost 28 million people and was pretty much destroyed, and not the prosperous West, which got enriched in this war, began space exploration. Following that, guess what Admiral Rickover and then still unknown to the public, Congressman Kennedy, future president, were talking about at the hearing in the US Congress. They stated the fact that the education system of Russia, the Soviet Union, had provided this breakthrough. Only the Soviet education system made it possible. Furthermore, the United States had no chance to catch up with Russia. Well, they had captured German scientists, but it left them with researchers by the Third Reich. Not more than that. NATO's report on the Soviet education system concluded, the end is near. If the Soviet Union doesn't play along with the West, it will be simply impossible to compete with it. Despite the fact that Khrushchev headed the country in 1961, the creative potential of Bolshevism, built after the Great October Socialist Revolution, the potential that, among other things, ensured the victory in the Great Patriotic War, was still in force. Khrushchev just couldn't hamper dynamic development and fully stop it. That is why the first flight into space became possible, having demonstrated that our science had been leading the whole world, that the country's tremendous potential had left Western countries no chance in competition with the Soviet Union. What did the Trotskyists do? The Trotskyists began to slow down the development of the Soviet Union, creating all sorts of problems within the country. They started to send the resources needed by the Soviet Union for improving life of its own people to the West, thus helping the latter to linger until the party nomenclature betrays the country. Within the framework of that betrayal, they participated in the imitating campaign of the alleged American astronauts going to the moon. The Americans cannot offer any proof for their astronauts' moon landing. The partisans of the yes version went out of their way to find evidence, and bingo, they came up with an idea. Guys, no worries, we have got the film. Any object exposed to radiation bears traces of this radiation. Therefore, the film on which they filmed their landing on the moon must carry the entire spectrum of radiation to which the film was exposed. Let us do a spectral analysis of that film. What happened next? NASA lost the tape, the entire original one. They only have in possession Stanley Kubrick's one, made in Hollywood, presenting them as being on the moon. That is, the Americans have to be constantly hiding evidence, proving that they didn't step on the moon, no matter how hard optimists are trying to prove the opposite. That is precisely the reason why Gagarin was killed. It was impossible to carry on the American lunar fraud while Gagarin was alive. He would never lie. He traveled all over the world. He witnessed the fact that all humankind had stepped into space. He wouldn't lie about the Americans being on the moon. The American astronauts have never been on the moon. Nevertheless, we hear them shouting about the gorgeous American space program. But Russia's space program is something inferior. Why do they always speak in terms of Russia? Why is the word Soviet deliberately erased everywhere? Because they cannot accept the fact that Bolshevism ensured progress, developed the genetic potential of as many people in the country as possible. It granted the secure functioning of the Russian world and showed how to live in a human way. Bolshevism proves that the West, which has always come to Russia with war, is intellectually fruitless. How can the Vlasovites allow it? How can those who put a tricolor flag over the Kremlin, who cover with shields a victory monument, mausoleum, during the victory parades? Remember that the mausoleum was part of the victory parades twice. First time it was on November 7th, 1941, and the second one on June 24th, 1945. How can they make it obvious to everyone that their master cannot offer an alternative to Russia, to the Russians? Their master cannot do it because he is intellectually defeated. How do the Vlasovites serve to the West then? By mere hatred to the dynamically developing country under the red banner. They felt happy under white-blue-red period, when the country was dumb and unable to utter a word. When in 10 years more people perished than during the entire Soviet period, whereas in the Soviet period 28 million people died for saving their country, 10 years tricolor period with its triple death was because the Vlasovites occupied the Kremlin and ruled the country. Here's the tactic of these bastards. At first, without prior agreement, taking advantage of their official position, they do some dirty trick. For example, they hoist the tricolor over the country. Did they ask people for their opinion on raising tricolor over the Kremlin? No, they didn't. They just threw that Vlasov's rag in their face. Now they raise a question. Do you wish to put it down? In this case, you should follow very specific procedures as the only lawful way to do it. At the same time, we shall talk nonsense about tricolor's achievements. What achievements? The achievements began only since we got a normal anthem. Even though the situation is still out of control because we have the Vlasovites flag. Another example. They gathered a crowd of drunken thugs who removed the monument to Dzerzhinsky. Now they say, well, if you want to restore it, you must incur to the legal procedure. Well, we removed it in an unlawful way. We could do anything we wanted. If you wish to set it back, jump through the legal hoops now. We shall set a commission of vindictive and bastards like him, who will decide whether you Russian lowlifes are worthy to have your own history, which we are constantly befoiling. The Vlasovites are befoiling Russian history. They do what they need without prior notice. Afterward, they tell us you must do everything legally. These hypocrites keep asking, what have you done in 30 years period, while you have Putin as the head of the country? I put a question, do we have a red banner flying over the Kremlin? Do we carry out a victory parade with the mausoleum open? We do not. This means that in our country the power still belongs to the Vlasovites, who dream of surrendering Russia. The celebration of the 60th anniversary of the flight of Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin shows how strong the Vlasovites are. They override the very mention of the Soviet Union and Soviet power wherever possible, presenting it as if some nameless nobody made the spaceflight somewhere, somehow. Still, one should accept that the celebration of the 60th anniversary is going much better than the celebration of the 50th anniversary. Remember, in 2011, a demon, Dmitry Medvedev, was the P-resident of the United States of America in Russia. What was the celebration like then? Then a hysterical tonality prevailed. We will never be able to achieve in space exploration what the Americans achieved. We don't need it at all. It only takes money from us. It is like pumping money into the abyss. As if we were flying on American engines and not vice versa. All the engines that the Soviet Union created for its lunar program proved to be modern enough for the American astronautics that they had been using these engines till today. Engines got out of stock just recently. The Americans buy engines from us. They cannot manufacture them themselves, but they convince us that we have lagged behind them. Our spaceplane project, Buran, was deliberately destroyed, whereas the American dead-end program Space Shuttle has just exhausted. Nobody could develop it further and save it. How do American astronauts get to the orbit? On our ships. Oh yeah, they have got Musk now. Did Dmitry Olegovich Rogozin mention anything about these ships? No, he didn't. However, it was an opportunity to show how poorly engineered the spacecraft that they use is. Americans fly on the spaceship, similar to the very first Gagarin spacecraft. In Russia, we consider spaceships of the Gagarin's era being unsafe and dangerous, and not suitable for space flights anymore. We remember the outcome of the mass hysteria on hopelessness for Russia to catch up with Americans ever. They are so much ahead of us in space development. It resulted in our Progress spacecraft falling from orbit. What good news for Dimon, Dmitry Medvedev. We proved that Russia in liberal slang, cannot have space programs. However, there exists global governance. The global governance looks at it from another angle. Well, suppose there will be no engine production in Russia. How to move the American space program ahead? As a result, Dimon's supervisor at NASA lost his job. Then they explained to Dimon, "You won't be running for the next presidential election. You are the fool. It is better to lose with a smart one than to win with a fool. The loss with a smart one is minimal, much smaller than it could be and potentially beneficial in the long run. The win with a fool, it is always a catastrophe." Therefore, they had to involve Putin again. Let him develop the country if he can. Preventing Putin from saving these technologies would have heavy consequences of progressive collapsing of the entire civilization on planet Earth. What was the reaction by US country elite? They ignited Bolotnaya protests, aiming at the Maidan, the state coup in Russia. All they do all day long is hating Russian people. Do you expect them to get up and pronounce that Russians had some achievements, and these achievements took place under Soviet Union flag? Under Soviet Union flag! Under Soviet Union flag, the population was steadily growing, and people's prosperity was increasing. Under the Soviet Union flag, the country was superpower number one, and nobody dared to speak to Russia dismissively. What do we have now? Look at the offensive message on the website of the Chancellor Merkel. It is absolutely insulting. She requested from Putin. The verb fordern is for to request, to challenge, to call, and its typical context is like to challenge to a duel. Quite a rude statement. Why is it happening? Just because they see how many people in Russia's leadership hate the country, who dream of kneeling in before a foreign invader. Where did this tricolor came from? Hitler gave it to the Vlasovites. You can find the video on the internet of how contemporary Vlasovites are celebrating the tricolor over the Kremlin, the tricolor for which Vlasovites were fighting. Russian people were dying from hunger from wars arranged by modern Vlasovites. Now Putin overcomes this and revives the country. Can Vlasovites accept this? No, Vlasovites cannot. And all the enemies of Russia see that and strongly rely on them. That is why enemies afford to behave in this neglectful way towards Russia. Could anyone dare to talk in the same manner to the Soviet Union while the red banner was flying over the Kremlin? Nobody dared. Therefore, realizing that Russia, the Soviet Union, Bolshevism, represented by Gagarin's flight, demonstrated to the world the technical perfection, the model of society that lead to prosperity. Russia's domestic enemies, both in the Kremlin and in the government, did everything that people didn't make a connection between the first flight into space and the Soviet Union in their minds. Because the Grimy proved to be capable. The Grimy did everything that the aristocracy was not able to do. They abandoned Russia and thought that the country would perish without them. However, Russian people survived and moved the country ahead. When all this rubbish, all these parasites fled, the country soared and became the superpower number one. Only because of the deliberate betrayal of the Communist Party and the Soviet nomenclature, the Soviet Union collapsed. Now the country is rising again. How can they put up with it? They cannot. Understanding that the anniversary of Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin's flight into space can contribute to the revival of Russia's sovereignty, they are doing everything possible to break the connection between this historic event and the Soviet Union in the minds of new generations. How? They erased the USSR superscription on the Gagarin's helmet in documentary films. They moved the shot frame in such a way as to cut the USSR from Gagarin's helmet. As to the filthy presentation that Roscosmos under Rogozin arranged, the camera angles, arrangement, and outlay they choose, it is just disgusting. No wonder, being an American lackey, Rogozin hates the country to such an extent, hates Russia so bluntly, that it doesn't need any additional proof. Where is the Vostochny Cosmodrome? Rogozin personally supervised its construction, and the cost of the whole project ended up 3 times more of the original budget. Where is it? That is the proof of his patriotism. Go to the Roscosmos website and see how it presents the celebration of the flight of Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. It has nothing to do with patriotism. He is an ideal American lackey who, by an animal instinct to the point of frenzy, hates Russia and the Russians and is ready to genocide them. This is the current situation. The flag over the Kremlin epitomizes it. Let us talk about the victory parade. Yes, this is our parade of winners, but the parade is heralded by Vlasov's tricolor, and Vlasovites say, "You think you won? Look, this is our parade. We won and are offering you Russian cattle to our master, the foreign invader. The foreign occupier now owns the wealth of Russia. The White Guards and the Vlasovites fought for this purpose during the Civil and the Great Patriotic Wars, and now they achieved their goal. They fought against Russia, against Russians. Now they proudly declare, we have planted this flag over Russia, the colonial flag, and this colony has no right even to raise its voice." This is the situation. Of course, the date of the 60th anniversary of the flight of Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin could be celebrated in a proper manner. It could show the glorious history of the Soviet Union and Russian history in general. However, Vlasovites used this event only as a backdrop to talk again about the achievements in space of the Americans, which don't exist. There are no American achievements in space. There are our achievements, and Americans are relevant in space only in context of Russian achievements. However, none of Russian government officials even mentioned it. The anniversary was an excellent occasion. The Americans did build a space station. They tried to do something, but their Skylab crashed onto Australia, killed a farmer, and destroyed the farm. We had Mir Station, several of them, and there was Salute Station. Who created the International Space Station? Again, Russia did. Russia created the ISS, but Americans are in commanding role on it. How so? The ISS already has a lot of modules. However, the most technically advanced, most reliable and safest module, in which everyone escapes in case of emergency, turns out to be Russian, and the only one that has no acceptance certificate, and therefore the Russians have no right to command this station. Americans are always in command, despite having one technical problem after another. They couldn't even build a toilet for space, but they are talking of high matters. Why are Americans granted that right? Because there are Vlasovites in the Kremlin. The message of Nabiullina's, head of Russian Central Bank, recent speech concisely is as follows: "We must destroy the Russian ruble in order to save the Americans. We shouldn't be such right-siders when the Americans have problems." Silyanov, the Minister of Finance: "Do you expect me to develop this country?" Also, remember their campaign for destroying our high school education? They're eliminating it. The most disgusting films about teachers came out in succession. They're depriving teachers from any right for respect. They annihilate the authority of a teacher. Moreover, they make these films with public money. Did they produce any good movies about the Great Patriotic War? Nothing but nastiness. They put sound and positive thoughts in the mouth of traitors, and all heroes think exclusively like Vlasovites. You didn't betray your motherland, you betrayed me. This is a sample of Vlasovites' individualist ideology. There was the opposite principle in the Soviet Union. You didn't betray me, you betrayed the motherland. All the memories, reminiscences of the soldiers of the Great Patriotic War witness to it. Why do they substitute concepts? To confuse the minds of the young Russians, to make them imitate movie heroes. He is a hero, I will think the same way, and I will become an individualist. This way, individualists will grow in numbers, and they won't be able to defend the country. They won't be able to defend their motherland, and they will become Vlasovites. The Vlasovites are being raised and educated through movies about the Great Patriotic War. Not a single proper movie appeared. Everywhere there is a propaganda of Nazism, the Third Reich, while they are dragging the Soviet Union through the mud. Why did Soviet people die? What for? Hitler's country was so beautiful. They should have surrendered to Hitler. The fact of celebrating the 60th anniversary of Gagarin's spaceflight is good. However, this also highlighted how problematic our governance in the country is. How many Vlasovites is there? For many, it is not obvious that Galkova, deputy prime minister of Russian government, Popova, the head of Russian Consumer Protection Agency, and others have done under the coronavirus hysteria here. For many, it is not obvious that they dreamed of putting on a muscle on the entire country, arranged totalitarian fascism here in order to give the resources of Russia to their foreign master, and that they are fighting the coronavirus in order to create conditions for a coup d'etat. Why is Nabiullina fighting for prices to rise? Because they must bring people to the boiling point when they go to the streets and make a picture of a coup d'etat for the media. With this picture on hand, they will bring back the blessed 90s again, when people in Russia will simply die out and resources of the country will be given to the West for nothing.